In this first part of our tutorials, we're going to start by making the very first parts of our game. In this tutorial, we're simply going to create our first object and our first sprite and put them into a room. We're not going to expect it to do anything yet, just simply get it in a room and have the game actually start up. So the first thing, if you haven't already done so, you'll need to start a new project, and that project should be a GameMaker language project, not a drag and drop. You need to give it a name. You should use any naming convention that you've been given. In my school's case, we use our last name, then our first name, and then the name of the file that we're working on. So for myself, it's going to be, we'll call this first game. And again, save it in whatever location would be relevant for you. Okay, when we have our new file, there's not very much there yet, but the main thing to note is we do in fact have a room set up already. So a default room called room 0 is already created for us. We'll keep using that room, but we are going to rename it quickly. It is a good idea to always use a good naming convention for all resources. In my case, I use a prefix for all of my resources. So I'm going to rename this room and I'm going to call it RM, and I'll just keep the same room name for the moment. But the important part is I put an RM at the front to represent this as a room. That's perfectly fine. The next thing I'm going to do is create a sprite. Now, sprites, the way I like to think of them, sprites are simply a costume. It's the way an object's going to look. Sprites contain things like the animation, so that the actual way it moves around. Sorry, not moves around on the screen, but the way it looks like it's moving. So if an arm's waving or an eye's blinking or something like that. But they don't actually do anything. So again, it's really just a costume. It's the way something looks as opposed to the actual functionality of that. So we're going to create a new sprite, and we're going to get an editing window, something like this. Now, by default, a sprite is usually 64 pixels by 64 pixels in size. If you're not aware of what pixels are, you might want to do a little bit of research on it. Basically, it's a unit of measurement that describes the size of an image. The important thing at the moment, 64 by 64 is quite small in our case. Most screens these days have a much higher resolution. So we're just going to make this a little bit bigger, and we're going to do that by editing our image first of all. Sorry, before we edit the image, we're going to change the size. I was just saying that, wasn't I? So we'll click on this area here, and we're just simply going to resize our image. Now you can do it by lots of different methods. You can see lots of different ways here by percentages and so on and so forth, but we're simply going to change it, the actual measurements here. So we're going to double it. So we're going to make it 128 by 128. So we're still keeping it a square. We're just literally making it twice the size. Now you might have noticed it looks like it's actually shrunk. Again, that's just because of our zoom factor. So I might just give us a bit more space here, and I'm going to zoom in to its full size. It may not be obvious now, but it looks like we've doubled. In fact, we have doubled each of these little squares. So basically, this grid pattern that you see represents transparency or see-through. So essentially, we have a completely see-through square at the moment, and we're going to draw something in there. I won't go into all the details at the moment. That's not important. This will come up later on. We're just simply going to get something drawn. So at this point, we're going to now edit our image, and we get what is essentially a drawing program. You can, of course, draw your sprites in any other drawing program. So you might use Photoshop or Critter or anything else that you're familiar with, essentially so you can get a picture. But we can do a lot of powerful stuff within this particular drawing. We're not going to do all that powerful stuff, of course. Again, we're just going to keep it very, very simple. So I'm going to use just some basic tools from the drawing area, and I'm going to draw a little alien spaceship in this particular case. So again, I'm not going for any sort of drawing awards here. I just want to put something on the screen. So if I maybe start with a bit of a saucer shape. Again, this is certainly no means the best drawing ever made. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to speed this up and maybe just jump to the end of when this has actually been drawn. Okay, so now I've drawn my little alien spaceship. Again, as I said earlier, not aiming for any sort of awards in art or graphics here. You can obviously spend as much time as you like drawing something that looks really good. And as I said, you can also draw it in lots of other different programs. But right now we have a sprite. So this is what our character is going to look like, basically. So at this point, I can close this down. And you can see here I have my character. As mentioned earlier, I should really name this properly. So again, my naming convention here is SPR for a sprite, and I'm going to call this player because that's going to be the character that I control later on. There's just one other thing I'd like to point out here, and that is, it's a bit hard to see, but there's this little crosshair up in the top left corner at the moment, and that is called our origin. Now, that's a very important point. It represents the center, if you like, of the image. And everything that you do later on gets calculated from this point. So I tend to like to set it to something near the center of the actual drawing. So you can see at the moment my person or my alien hasn't taken up every bit of this space, but I'm going to bring that down and put it sort of in the center here. So you can see my crosshair is a little bit more centered to the part of the drawing itself. This will become a lot more important later on, and we'll discuss origin in detail. But again, I just like to center it a bit more for this point. As I said, it'll make more sense later. So right now we can close that sprite altogether. And if we look in our sprite resources, you'll see it's there. So we can always double click on it to bring it back. But right now we'll just close it to give ourselves some more room. So as I mentioned before, a sprite really is just a costume. What we need now is to create an object. An object basically is the idea of something that can interact with something else. So it's like an actor, for example, who knows how to play a part. They know how to move around, to talk and interact with the scenery. But until you put the costume on them, they don't look like what they're supposed to. So we create the object first and give it actions that it can do. We then give it the sprite, so the costume, so that we know what it looks like. So if we come down here to our objects in our resources, again, we can right click and go create object. And I'm going to use a similar naming, OBJ, and I'm still going to call it player. We don't conflict with our other player because this has the prefix OBJ. Of course, you can't have two SPR players or two OBJ players. They would conflict with each other, but because they're different resources and we've used a different prefix to the name, it's perfectly fine. If we look just underneath the name, you'll see there is a sprite section, and basically we can now choose our sprite that we've made. We've only got the one so far. So by choosing this sprite, we've now given the object a shape. So it looks like something now. Over on this right side here is where we're going to eventually tell it how to do things. For the moment, we're not worried about that. We just wanted to get it created, give it a sprite, and now put it into our room. So for now, we're also just going to close this object off. And again, in our resources, you can see we have it there. We can always double click to bring it back. Okay. So our last step for this particular little video is just to put that object into our room. So if we double click on our room now, here is our room. And it's as easy as dragging an object into the room. We can theoretically drag it multiple times. This has some consequences, which we'll talk about at a later stage. But right now, the important thing is we can put an object into our... To see it actually working, we now want to run our game. So the easiest way is to go up to your menu and just choose to run your game, or you can press F5. Down the bottom, you'll see a whole lot of stuff scrolling. It may or may not take a little bit of time to actually happen, depending on if it's the absolute first time you're running the game. Potentially, if you've done something that you shouldn't have done so far and actually caused it to have an error. But basically, you should eventually get a game window such as this coming up. And here we can see the three ships, three little aliens that we put into the room. Again, they have no actions yet. We can't move them. They don't interact with anything. They just exist right now, but we have a shape. Okay, so that's it for this little video. The next one we'll do will be adding a little bit of movement to these little characters.